It's a funny thing, you know, you get given the responsibility to tell somebody's story. If it's true, you got to bust your balls for it. You got to go the extra mile. This is somebody else's life, you know, and I feel that responsibility very heavily. It's funny, you're making me very nostalgic just even talking about this sort of stuff. Obviously part of the process. Romper Stomper. You know, I read the script. I found it very, very difficult subject matter to deal with. Having grown up through the punk era, you know, I'd seen guys who were punks because of their music preference or because of making a stand against corporate rock. I'd seen some of those guys morph into neo-Nazis. I think I did probably 5, 6 physical auditions for that before I was cast in the role. Very short shoot, maybe 28 days. So super intense. You have to get into character very quickly. You're working with a group of young guys and everybody's a bit afraid of it. You know, Jackie McKenzie was the principal female lead. She didn't know what she was getting into either. You know, she'd come just out of film school, but it was the quality of the idea that you could attack such a heavy subject matter that was just so compelling and so attractive.
What the fuck are you afraid of? This is our place. No more running. We stop them here!
You know, it ended up being quite an incredible calling card for me. It definitely went ahead of me and did its own work. Sometimes to my detriment, though. I probably had at least a dozen conversations with directors in Los Angeles who had somehow been told the story that I was, in fact, a skinhead who had been discovered on the streets, dragged into the film world, but that wasn't the case at all. The next choice that I made in terms of a commercial movie was to play a gay rugby-playing plumber in a movie called The Sum of Us. I just always liked the idea that somebody who was into Romper Stomper for the wrong reasons saw that I was in another film, bought a ticket, and now they're sitting in front of The Sum of Us wondering how the fuck they got there. LA Confidential. And my process then was not to do smaller roles. I was already doing roles where my name was above the title, so I tried to stay in that pocket. I got the call from Curtis Hanson. He was really happy to find out that I had in fact done American movies already, which would give him potentially an easier point of argument to the studio, because his idea was to cast relative unknowns. You know, he sent me the script and I read the James Ellroy book, LA Confidential. And the thing that freaked me out was Bud White is described as physically the biggest man in the Los Angeles Police Department. I kind of got back on the phone with Curtis. We hadn't met yet. I said, man, I don't know what impression you might have got from the movies that you've seen, but, you know, I'm not really like a big bloke, mate, you know. His vibe on that was that everything that he required in Bud White he'd seen in other work, and that was immaterial to him. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you, officer.
That obvious, huh?
It's practically stamped on your forehead.
It was a weird situation because the big overarching studio and the studio directly making the movie didn't like Curtis's idea. So I was flown in and I was put up at a hotel in the time we were supposed to be rehearsing. But, you know, I've got, you know, friends in the business and stuff, and people would be telling me that Sean Penn was going to be playing my role. You know, I was talking to the director, and that was my character to play. But at one point in time, they stopped paying my hotel bill and rental car bill, stopped providing me with per diem, and I really didn't have, you know, a lot in my life at the time, so I wasn't able to pay for that level of hotel, etc. And so it got pretty heavy, and to the point where, you know, there was a few times there where I was going down the back stairs, so the hotel manager wouldn't stop me in the foyer and ask me what was going on. I could feel all of that stuff around me, and the only thing I had to go on was the surety of the director that he'd made his choice. So I just went with that, and I just kept turning up to work. I think if there was ever a day where I got frustrated by it and I hadn't turned up to work, that would have been the chink in the armor that they would have used to shift me out of the role. You know, and the same process happened with Guy, with Guy Pearce.
Why don't you go after criminals for a change instead of cops?
Stensland got what he deserved, and so will you.
Curtis asked me about Guy. He was a regular character on a soap opera called Neighbours that I dropped in on and did like a small character for 2 or 3 days. And I had a girlfriend I eventually ended up marrying some many, many years later. And I'm a very jealous person. And we walked into this pub and Guy was there and he greeted her effusively and gave her a cuddle and a kiss. And I'm sort of standing there. He hasn't even acknowledged my existence at this point in time. So I waited till there was a lull in their conversation and I stepped forward and I gave him a kiss. And I behaved effusively like he was doing with Danielle, because why can't I join in? And he didn't do anything. He acknowledged with his eyes, sorry mate, that was a bit dicky of me to cut you out of the conversation. And later on when I was talking to Curtis, and I told him that story, and I told him how completely cool under fire Guy Pearce had been. And I think that really fell into the part of Guy that Curtis had thought he'd seen in the auditions. And so that's how we became that team in that movie. The Insider. Yeah, at the time, definitely the most difficult job I'd done. I got contacted by Michael Mann, you know, and he asked me to fly down to Los Angeles and talk to him, and he sent me the script and I read it. And I couldn't work out what character that he wanted me to play because it was a script full of middle-aged men. I rang him first and said, I don't get what character. And he said, the guy, man, the lead guy, you know. And I was like, yeah, that guy's, he's 50-something, I'm 30-something. Michael said, look, just come and see me. Let's come and talk to me, you know. We had a very, very long conversation without any fences, and we talked about this and that to do with society and corporate malfeasance and blah, 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 blah. And it was a great chat, you know. And I said to him, look, I don't get why you want me to play this character. I'm not the age. I don't look anything like him. Michael sort of came around from behind his desk and he said, listen, man, I didn't fly you down here because of what you looked like. And he put his hand on my chest. He said, I flew you down to meet you because of what you have in here. And pushing that, you know. And it was like in that moment, I was like, I'm going to work with this guy. I'm going to do anything he wants. I'm going to climb any mountain. So he really worked out who I was because he frickin' got a hook in me very deeply, you know. Jeffrey is, you know, a nice fellow, but he's kind of an uncomfortable fellow. And he'd had a very strange journey, you know, where he begins in the Bronx and ends up sort of working in Japan and doing all these things that gave his voice such a crazy, colorful array because, you know, now he's working in the tobacco industry, for example, and he's working in Kentucky. So as a scientist, he's never used words connected to the tobacco industry. So when he says those words, they have a pronounced Southern lilt. But a lot of the time, he has that Bronx bass. But the Bronx bass is also infused with the fact that he spoke Japanese for a number of years in his life. So I'm looking at it going, what the fuck do I do with this? You know, it was a bit of a mind-blowing experience.
So what you're saying is it isn't enough that you fired me for no good reason. Now you question my integrity. On top of the humiliation of being fired, you threaten me. You threaten my family. It never crossed my mind not to honor my agreement. I will tell you, Mr. Sandifer, and Brown and Williamson too, fuck me. Well, fuck you.
Michael is such a perfectionist and he wants to really know what he has and what he's going for and stuff. So, you know, one example, my very young hair would just not sit like Jeffrey Wigand's old hair. So we bleached it. The color came back. We bleached it again. The color came back. I think we ended up bleaching it 7 times in a period of 3 weeks. And then we started to shave the volume out of it, you know. My young hair would just go, and it would be there the next day. And if we were going to do it that way, we would have to be shaving my head in those areas every morning. And still, no matter how much volume we cut out of my hair, no matter how many undercuts and everything that we did, 1 or 2 days later, it would go, and it would find a way to cover my head. So we were standing there doing a screen test, and I was so pleased to find out that Dante Spinotti, who I'd met first on The Quick and the Dead, director of photography, was on The Insider as well, because, you know, I had a great relationship with his camera crew guys, and I was really excited to know that it was him. And I was standing there, and possibly a little offensive, you know, I said, you know, this is not working with the hair, man, you know. I've got to get a wig. I've got to have like really shit hair. I've got to have hair like his. And pointed at Dante. And Dante's got lovely hair, but it was of the right age, you know, and it was behaving in the way that Jeffrey's hair behaved, you know. So we got an incredible wig maker. With the wig, it just made me feel like the character, you know. And that was like it was quite a big thing for me, because even while I'm doing The Insider, I'm still really formulating who I am as a film actor. It's probably my 16th or 17th movie by then. That really showed me that because of the visual nature of film, if somebody says you're going to play a pirate, you know, get an eye patch, you know, rent a parrot. You might immediately feel more connected to the character of a pirate if you do so. I did not feel I could play that role until I looked in the mirror and it looked like Jeffrey. Now, other times I've done characters where I feel I don't necessarily need to be accurate, but because his story was so real, because it had such a deep psychological effect on him and his family, and because it was such an important step in the legal and cultural life of America, I just felt this need to honor him and be very careful about honoring him. So, you know, I met a whole bunch of fantastic actors in that job, you know, to be surrounded by people like Al Pacino and Christopher Plummer. Somebody from the film company at the time rang me to tell me that they were going to mount an Academy Award campaign on my behalf. And I said, oh, cool, you know, so that's like me and Al, that's fantastic. And they said, no, well, we're going to put our emphasis on you. And we asked Mr. Pacino, and he said, back the kid. It's a massive thing for him to have done.
You didn't mention my name. You haven't talked to anybody about me.
Why
Brown and Williamson? No, I spoke.
How the hell do I know about Brown?
It happened just after I talked to you.
I don't know.
I do not like coincidence.
Well, I don't like paranoid accusation.
Time came up later in my career. It was the movie Cinderella Man. Paul Giamatti's mum died during the course of shooting of Cinderella Man, and I made her a promise on the phone that Paul was such an incredible actor that he would be nominated. And the studio asked me what I wanted to do, and I said, back the kid. And Paul Giamatti got an Academy Award nomination. So The Insider is very, very important for my growth as an actor, and also extremely important for the way my career went just after that. Cinderella Man. I'd worked with Ron Howard on A Beautiful Mind, and I gave him the script, and he said, you know, look, I understand why you want to do it. He said, but I don't understand why I would want to direct it. It's like ground so many people have covered, you know? And I said to him, well, it's just like A Beautiful Mind, man. The importance of this story is that it's true. This guy, this is what happened to him. You know, he was a boxer, he was successful. He owned a cab company. Well, if you own that cab company in Manhattan and Wall Street crashes in 1929 and people can't afford to take cabs, it's possibly the only time in history that owning a cab company in Manhattan has been a negative thing. But so, you know, Jim, from going through his sporting career and rising to a certain middle-class position, sank and slid all the way back to the bottom again, and then out of pure desperation, rose and became a champion. And I'd fallen in love with that story when I first read it, and it was super important to me. And I think I was very passionate with Ron describing why it was important. So he came on board. And, you know, it's just one of the natures of film. If he hadn't have come on board, I probably don't make that film in the cycle of things. If we had to start from scratch and find another director, it probably reshapes, you know?
I had a run of bad luck. And this time around, I know what I'm fighting for.
Oh, yeah? What's that, Jimmy?
Milk.
You know, through the course of the process of that, it was like physically extremely tough role. I've actually done more difficult physical roles since, but at that time, the preparation for that film, and it, you know, if I could show you a list of what we were doing on a daily basis. It was heavy stuff, and you know, Ron is a very serious director, and he brought Angelo Dundee, who trained 15 world champions, into my life. And Angelo constructed the energy in the training camp. And, you know, I mean, sometimes you just get so lucky. Having Angelo Dundee with all of his wisdoms and experiences come into my life as a mentor. You know, I only knew him alive for 8 years, but what a joyful person he was, what an inspirational person, you know. Occasionally I would sort of just say to him, I don't know how I'm going to do this. He just had a way of making you believe. So it required an immense amount of discipline to play that character. You know, I was so into that world, so into that place. When I made the decision that because I'm playing a boxer, at a certain point in time, I would have a prosthetic nose, and at a certain point in time, I would have cauliflower prosthetic ears. Also, because of the black and white photographs I'd seen of Jim Braddock, he had very kind of wingnut ears, you know, poking out from the side of the head. So we had these pieces made, which pushed my ears out like that. And Ron Howard came to see me, and he's like, you know, Russell, as a guy who grew up with ears like that, I'm just wondering if we need to make that kind of decision. Do we need to be that accurate? I kind of saw what their problem was later on when they sort of were trying to market the movie. Every image, you know, even if it was a romantic image and they were focusing on the love story between my character and Renee's character, I got the nose, I got the ears. Gladiator, after I'd finished The Insider, Ridley and Michael had a conversation. I went to meet Ridley. I looked like absolute shit. I don't see how he could possibly have seen me as a Roman general, but we really got on. He had gigantic ideas, and I kind of thought most of them were impossible, really. And it certainly wasn't on the page. There was no script that we could be enthused about. But what I was enthused about was the simple idea. It's 184 AD or 180 AD. You're a Roman general, and you're being directed by Ridley Scott. You know, so that drove my motivation a lot. You know, it was very difficult putting on those clothes and going, oh yeah, off we go. I'm a Roman general. And I know that Joaquin Phoenix had the same problem because we talked about it, you know. The heights that those characters had to go to, you know, and it's very different because at that stage, you know, if you're wearing clothes like that, you're probably doing a comedy or a piss take. You know, sword and sandal things had been out of vogue for a long time. That whole idea was constructed around the sincerity of the core journey of a man's vengeance for the death of his wife and child. My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the North, general of the Felix Legions, loyal servant to the true emperor Marcus Aurelius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next. It's funny though, you see the backstage or behind the scenes footage and everybody's just goofing around and being silly, and you know, the reason you do that is you're saving all your serious shit for after the guy says action, you know. Most people, the complexities of film are such that you have to have everything organized to the nth degree. Your scheduling, you know, your purchasing, your crewing, all of these things have to be worked out. And particularly with your art department and, you know, your set dressers and everything, so everybody knows what they're doing. That's the way you make a film. However, we were making a movie that grew as we made the movie. And little things became big ideas. And we were being fluid within that gigantic $100+ million budget shape, which is all about schedules and disciplines and being exact about things, even down to, you know, there's one conversation I had with Ridley where I said I wanted to decapitate a guy, you know, and at the end of this fight sequence. And he said, well, look, you know, I can't just add a decapitation. It's a pretty heavy thing. I'm going to have to discuss it with the studio and everything. And I said, look, this is the way the choreography goes at the moment. And I showed him. I said, this is what I want to change it to. And I showed him. And he could see that it was more dynamic and more part of the character. And the last move of that sequence was this decapitation, you know. And he's literally smoking a cigar. He's heard what I've had to say. He's watched it, you know, a couple of puffs on a cigar. And he calls out to his first assistant director and he goes, "Terry, how many heads have we got left?" You know? But working with Ridley, I always liken it to working with some great Renaissance painter. Just the way he sees the world. And that level of artistry, he converts onto the screen. You know, I've ended up making 5 movies with Ridley, and every single one of those experiences, you know, has got to be in my top 10 of films that I've made. Robin Hood. Actually, my first step on Robin Hood, when the idea came up, was grab every Robin Hood book that I could, big bag of them, and I got on a boat in northern Queensland and just started to read. So I just wanted to know what the mythology was, as much of it I could find out. And it occurred to me, and what I brought up with Ridley, was that we all have a reshaped view of Robin Hood, which it comes from Victorian times. But in fact, this legend started many, many hundreds of years before then. We started looking at the facts of the currently understood myth and the realities of the history timeline. And always in stories of Robin Hood in a modern era, King Richard comes into the story. He's been away on crusade, and he comes into the story at the end of the story to sort of save the day, you know, confirm that Robin is a good man, and the Sheriff of Nottingham was incorrect, and blah, blah, blah. But what we discovered is that, you know, apart from a few months earlier in his life, King Richard was French. He didn't make it back to England. He went on crusades and he died in France. That was our first hook. It's like, okay, everybody else is expecting a Robin Hood where King Richard comes in at the end to save the day. Our Robin Hood begins with the death of King Richard, who died putting a castle to siege in France. You know, and of course I got to work with the magnificent Kate Blanchett, or La Blanchett, as I call her, on that film, and found out that, you know, not only is she a wonderful actress, she's spectacular company as well.
Robert, I'm ashamed of you.
Hello, Marion. I've come to save you. I remember standing on that set in the Bournewood, the same place we'd shot certain parts of Gladiator, and I'm looking up the hill at this French castle that the art department have built on top of the hill. And I'm looking around me, hundreds of archers, and we have 180 horses galloping down the beach. This is probably the last physical production of this scale that I ever get to do. You know, things were changing so rapidly, and it's proven to be that way. Now, sure, I've been on big budget films, but not in that kind of scale where everything's built, you know. Look, the idea of this script was kind of nauseating when I first read it. I really didn't think I wanted to have anything to do with it. But then, you know, somebody asked me actually, well, why are you not going to do it? You know, and it's like, because it's really scary. And it scares me that this is actually something that does happen. This individual, this character, is acting on such a basis of a lack of humanity, a lack of empathy, and he is imploding, and he's going to take her with him.
Ma'am, are you okay?
I'm pretty sure the guy in that truck's following me.
He's road raging.
Why don't you just chill, man? Go your own way.
You know, one of the things that was really important to me with this is that we don't at any stage try to justify his actions or his thought process, because most of us will go through this sort of thing and be, you know, it's just the ups and downs and the foibles and quirks of life. But this particular man has decided that all of this adds up to his right to destroy and terrorize. And we've seen that kind of personality at play. I mean, 20 years ago, I would have, in my mind, kind of written this off as some kind of anomaly, you know? But that's the thing that kept playing on my mind when you know, school shootings and shootings in nightclubs. But it is the same thought process. And therefore, it became more important to me, and it's particularly based off my conversations with Derek and his perspective as a filmmaker. I knew that this movie ends up not being just about thrills and crashes and violence. This movie ends up being a direct commentary on the state of American society, Western society today. So it went from being the thing I was most scared of to the thing I just felt most responsible to have to do. So, GQ, and those of you that have tuned in, that's the end of that. I've been boring your tits off for quite some time now, talking about some of my iconic characters, iconic being somebody else's definition, and I'm just the putz who has to say it. But anyway, hope you got something out of it. Enjoy yourself, and thank you, GQ.